Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerCoaching.com, and today we're going to be going through a hand from a 2,000, 4,000 pound no limit hold'em game presented by Triton Poker. This is an incredibly high stakes game. Let's take a look at what happens. Here we have Wang opening up with ace king offsuit in the hijack seat, which is perfectly fine and perfectly standard. He makes it 2.5 big blinds, which I think is fine. I have no problem with that. I may raise to a little bit bigger, like 3 big blinds before the flop if most people are playing 125 big blinds deep, but whatever, 2.5 big blinds is certainly acceptable. Tom Dwan on the button picks up pocket nines. This is a hand you definitely want to call with. If you 3-bet and then get 4-bet, it is miserably bad. I'm not exactly sure how aggressive the players are playing, but you really don't want to be getting 4-bet when you have pocket nines. And if you do 3-bet and get called, which very often will happen because the player in the hijack should be opening reasonable hands, a lot of the flops are not going to be great for you. So you'd much rather just call and see a flop in position. Now, Tsang has queen jack offsuit in the small blind. If Wang made a bigger raise, like 3.5 big blinds or 3 big blinds, I think you should probably just fold the queen jack offsuit in the small blind. Every once in a while, the big blind is going to 3-bet and you're going to have to fold, which is terrible. Also, queen jack offsuit flops a whole lot of middle pair bad kickers, which is not really what you want. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to just fold the queen jack offsuit early. That said, calling is certainly reasonable. If you are going to be kind of snug in one seat, it is the small blind because you just have the worst position after the flop. And then Yang wakes up with 5-4 of hearts in the big blind. This is an easy call. You definitely want to see the flop and see if you make something. So the flop comes king 5-4, giving everyone something besides Tom Dwan. I imagine it's just going to check around to the ace king, which should probably make a bet. Now, when you are in this scenario in a multi-way pot, it's very important that you don't just blindly continuation bet with your whole range, as you may do if, let's say, you raised the hijack and the big blind called. Because in this scenario, when 3 people see the flop, especially the button and the small blind, they're going to have a decent amount of middle and high cards in their range. And a king jack 5 connects decently well with middle cards and high cards, right? So for that reason, Wang should not be betting here if he just completely misses the flop or if he has a very marginal made hand like jack 10. Instead, he wants to be betting with mostly his best made hands that can bet the flop, bet the turn in, bet the river for value if the board does not change, as well as his draws, like straight draws and flush draws. When you use that strategy, you're essentially using what's referred to as a polarized strategy. You're betting your best made hands that are almost certainly best at the moment, and your draws that could improve to be the best hand. Your opponents don't really know what they should be doing. That's very different than what a lot of recreational players do. They bet with only their really strong made hands, or perhaps their really strong made hands and their marginal made hands. And then when they bet, well, they have something good, and you can play accordingly. And when they check, they have nothing, and you can very easily play against a range containing a lot of nothing. Anyway, in this scenario, I think if Wang is going to bet, he probably wants to bet pretty big, like 30,000, 34,000, something like that, and put pressure on his opponents. Because if you think about the hands the opponents are going to call with, it's going to be a whole lot of hands containing a king or a jack or draw. And a king or jack or draw is going to call any reasonable amount. So this is a spot where you definitely want to bet on the bigger side. He does go 23,000, which is fine, but I think a little bit bigger is probably better. And now Tsang is in a pretty nasty spot, because if Wang does have that range I just laid out, perhaps good king, like king, queen, and better, and draws, well, queen jack is in pretty bad shape against that, right? That said, the bet is medium size, so will he realize roughly 27-ish% equity in the spot? He probably will. So given he'll realize roughly that equity, I think it's probably okay to call in this scenario. And once he calls, Yang with his bottom pair just needs to fold. You may say, but if he gets a 5 or a 4, he has the best hand. Shouldn't he call and just play this like a 5-out draw? The problem is that the 4 of clubs may not be good. Also, he could just be dead already against a set, right? There's no reason that Wang cannot just have pocket kings or pocket jacks. So this is a scenario where some people will splash around with a 5-4 if it goes bet, call on the flop. But you definitely should just fold in this scenario. Even if it was heads up, you should probably just fold to this bet. It's just too likely you're going to be in bad shape. And also, you have to think that given Wang should be polarized, he's just going to keep betting on a lot of turns and rivers, and the bottom pair is not going to be able to get to the showdown all that often. All right, now, this is the interesting point in the hand. A 10 of clubs comes off on the turn, and now Tsang decides to turn his hand into a bluff, which is an interesting play. He bets 50,000 into the 86,000 pot. And you may say, why in the world would you do that? How much was the pot? Was it 86? Yeah, it was 86. You may think, why in the world would he ever make this bet? Well, at this point, if you think about Tsang's range, he should probably actually not check raise the flop all that often with his draws, because this is a board that when Wang bets, he should have something pretty good. If he has a good draw, he's going to call a raise. If he has a good made hand, he's going to call a raise. So Tsang really just doesn't get to check raise the flop all that often, which means when he does check call, he should call with his best made hands, he should call with his reasonable draws, and he should call with his marginal made hands like he has. And so, interestingly enough, if that is exactly his range, if he had a draw, it just got way better. Like if he had queen 10, he probably doesn't need to turn that into a bluff. I mean, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. If he has a flush draw, though, that's just the nuts now. If he had a flush draw on the flop. So if he had a flush draw on the flop, that was the nuts, and that just got there. If he had something like two pair or one pair, he would probably just check. If he had a king, he would definitely just check, I would think. So if you think about the bottom of his range, what are the worst hands he has at this point? It's probably going to be hands like queen 10 and queen jack, right? I mean, what else could he really have that is worse than this hand? I mean, maybe he could have like ace of clubs 5 if he's really loose pre-flop, but he probably doesn't have that. He could have a hand like, really think about it. Try to find some worse hands than exactly queen jack at this point. I mean, I guess he could have jack 9. If he had jack 9, I mean, probably doesn't play too many of those pre-flop, so there really aren't very many combinations of that. So this is a neat spot where this hand is actually one of the worst hands in Tsang's range. And when you have one of the worst hands in your range, and the turn does connect decently well with some portion of your range, I mean, obviously it connects pretty great with the flush draws, you should consider finding some hands to bluff with. Now, I don't know if I ever actually make this bluff in game, but I think it's actually pretty sweet. The potential downfall of this bluff is that Wang could just have the nut flush, right? He would raise with all ace-x of clubs pre-flop in the hijack seat. Maybe not the marginal ones, but you know, whatever. He still has a decent number of them. And he would definitely bet, or probably bet with a lot of them on the flop. So the problem here is that Wang could just have all of the ace-high flush draws that got there on the turn. He could also have some queen-high flush draws like queen jack, queen 9, maybe even queen 8 if he's a little bit loose. He could also have 9-8, 8-7, 7-6. He could have all of those flush draws. So this play is especially strong when you have a read that your opponent perhaps doesn't bet the flop with all of his flush draws, which means when he does bet, he has fewer flush draws than a normal player. And also, it's particularly strong if you have some sort of live read that your opponent really doesn't like the 10 of clubs. Like imagine your opponent really just doesn't like the 10 of clubs in the spot. Then leading is great because if they're not going to call a turn bet and then a big river bet, you're going to get your opponent to fold almost their entire range. And even if he does have something like a set here, like imagine Wang had a set of 5s or a set of jacks. If you face a 50,000 turn bet and then a 200,000 river bet, are you really calling in a spot where your opponent is incredibly polarized to the nuts? And obviously Tsang has a whole lot of nuts in his range. And bluffs. And if you think about the bluffs, they actually have to be like looking kind of hard to turn their hands into bluffs. And most people just aren't doing that. So it's a pretty neat spot to turn a hand into a bluff. That said, once your opponents watch these replays and they know you're going to start turning every hand that can't really win too often at showdown into a bluff, well, they're going to start calling a lot. And if they start calling a lot, then you have to stop bluffing quite so much. So this is a pretty cool hand. I definitely like Tsang's turn bluff. I think it's something, you know, I might even implement into my game, especially with a live read. And you may say, did Wang mess this hand up in some way? I don't really think he did. I mean, he maybe could raise a little bit bigger pre-flop, but I think his play was fine. He could perhaps bet a little bit bigger on the flop, but again, I think his play is fine. And when your opponent takes this line, you just have to give him the pot. Sometimes you're going to fold the best hand, and that's part of poker. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click like, click subscribe. I appreciate it. Good luck in your games. Have fun, and I'll talk to you next time.